What if I told you that some of the most sacred and private conversations inside the walls of Buckingham Palace may not have been so private after all? What if I told you that every hushed discussion, every whispered family argument, every delicate plan about the monarchy's future may have been quietly captured, stored, and possibly weaponized? That isn't a plotline from a thriller. That is the explosive suspicion that continues to shadow Meghan Markle's time as a member of the royal family. Picture it. The gilded halls of Kensington, the thick velvet curtains drawn, advisors and royals gathered in secret, believing that what they say in confidence will never reach the outside world. Now imagine someone sitting among them, smiling, nodding, playing the perfect role, yet secretly recording every word. Could it really have happened? Could Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, have carried her own insurance policy in the form of recordings? And if she did, what would those recordings reveal? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not just idle speculation. Princess and Prince William themselves, according to insider whispers, were among the first to raise their eyebrows. They noticed things, subtle things, that didn't add up. A phone placed too conveniently. A glance that lingered too long. References Meghan made in later interviews that seemed just a little too specific, too close to what had been said in supposedly private family meetings. Now, stop and ask yourself this. If you discovered that your most intimate family moments might have been secretly recorded, how would you react? Hurt? Betrayed? Angry? Or would you feel something deeper? That gnawing fear that your words, your tone, even your emotions, could be twisted and replayed to the world for someone else's gain? The stakes here aren't just family drama. We're talking about the reputation of the monarchy, centuries of tradition, the image of one of the most scrutinized families on the planet. If Meghan really did keep secret recordings, the fallout would stretch far beyond palace walls. It could shatter trust, rewrite history, and give her a powerful bargaining chip in her dealings with the media, publishers, and Hollywood executives. And let's be honest, doesn't it feel eerily ironic? Meghan, who has consistently championed privacy, who has spoken about feeling invaded by paparazzi and the press, may have been quietly invading the privacy of the very family she joined. Hypocrisy or strategy? Protection or betrayal? That's the question we have to wrestle with. But before we dig too deep into and sharp observations or William's growing suspicions, we need to step back. Why would Meghan allegedly risk it all to capture those conversations? Was it fear of being silenced? Was it desperation to protect her own narrative? Or was it, as some allege, a cold and calculated plan to cash in on secrets once she and Harry inevitably broke away? The irony is delicious, isn't it? The palace has always been obsessed with controlling its own story. They've managed scandals, covered up affairs, reshaped narratives for decades. Yet if Meghan really kept her own recordings, it would mean she beat them at their own game, outmaneuvering a centuries-old institution by simply pressing record. And that's why this story matters now, more than ever. We live in a time where every leaked email, every secret video, every behind-the-scenes tape can alter careers, crush reputations, and change the course of history. Just ask yourself, how many scandals in the last decade have erupted simply because someone had the receipts? Now, imagine if the receipts in question belonged to the royal family. Let me paint a picture. Imagine Meghan years from now, perhaps after another round of interviews or another book deal, unveiling a tape that no one knew existed. A tape of Charles speaking candidly about succession. A tape of and fiercely criticizing Harry's choices. A tape of William, in a moment of private rage, saying words that could change public perception forever. Do you see the potential? Do you feel the weight of that possibility? The royal family, for all their pomp and grandeur, are still human. They argue. They vent. They make mistakes. And behind closed doors, they let their guard down. That's exactly why the thought of secret recordings is so terrifying. Because behind those palace gates, words are said that the public was never meant to hear. Now, you may be asking, how could Meghan even pull this off? The palace is supposed to be one of the most secure places on earth. Cameras everywhere. Staff constantly hovering. Protocols for everything. And yet, history shows us that some of the biggest scandals have slipped through the cracks not because of outsiders, but because of insiders. Remember Diana's secretly recorded phone calls? Remember Charles's infamous tampon-gate tape? Those weren't outsiders bugging the walls. They were insiders with access. And Meghan? She had access too. This is why people are still talking about it. This is why Anne and William's suspicions hit so hard. They weren't dealing with some faceless tabloid. They were dealing with someone at their own table, inside their own family, who might have been playing a completely different game. Now, let me ask you directly. If you were Meghan, isolated in a foreign country, surrounded by an institution you didn't fully trust, would you have considered recording those around you? Not for betrayal, perhaps, but for survival? Or do you believe that this crossed a line, one that families should never cross? Think about it. If those recordings exist, Meghan holds something no one else does. Undeniable, unfiltered truth. And truth, as we all know, can be both a weapon and a shield. But here's where things get really interesting. Meghan and Harry's deals with Netflix, Spotify, and publishing houses have already been worth millions. Yet critics have accused their content of lacking substance, of not delivering the explosive insider details people expected. Could those alleged recordings be the missing puzzle piece? The ace up Meghan's sleeve for a future payday? And if so, what does that say about trust? About loyalty? About family? The whispers, the suspicions, the irony, the stakes, all of it swirls together into one undeniable storm. A storm that could either fizzle out as rumor or explode into history if tapes ever surface. And the fact that William and Anne, two of the most respected members of the family, were the ones to raise concerns, that makes this story impossible to ignore. Because this isn't just gossip. This isn't just drama. This is about the heart of the monarchy, about whether the family's own words could be turned against them. And it's about Meghan. Was she a victim who took desperate measures to protect herself? Or was she a calculating outsider who came prepared to expose everything? And that brings us to the question no one can stop asking. If these recordings do exist, where are they now? Locked away? Handed over to publishers? Stored on encrypted devices? Or waiting in silence until the right moment to be unleashed? Because if there's one thing we know about Meghan Markle, it's that she always thinks ahead. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started with a whisper, not a scream, not a headline, just a whisper that floated through the halls of the palace, quiet but sharp, the kind of whisper that makes people turn their heads and lower their voices. Someone asked the question no one dared put into words. Is Meghan recording us? Imagine the scene. A long mahogany table in a private room of Kensington Palace, gilded portraits of ancestors looming above, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of history. Around the table sat senior royals, advisors, and family members, voices carefully measured, words chosen with surgical precision. These meetings weren't casual chats over tea. These were war councils, the monarchy's survival strategy against an unforgiving media and an increasingly skeptical public. Every sentence mattered. Every sigh, every pause, every exchange behind closed doors was meant to stay locked within those walls. And yet, over time, something felt off. Meghan would reference things later, phrases, inside jokes, snippets of emotion, that were never meant to leave the room. It wasn't obvious at first. Subtle, almost innocent. But as those moments piled up, the unease grew. Someone was listening too closely. Or worse, someone was recording. Think about it. If you were in that room, if you were Prince William, Princess, or even King Charles himself, how would you feel? Exposed? Betrayed? Afraid? After all, it wasn't a stranger sneaking in with a microphone. It was family. Let's rewind for a moment. Meghan was an outsider. An American actress who suddenly found herself inside the world's most exclusive, most scrutinized family. She wasn't born into this institution, she entered it. And that alone carried weight. Every word spoken to her, every private moment shared, carried risk. Trust takes years to build, but only seconds to shatter. Now picture the whispers. They didn't start as accusations. They began as questions. Why did Meghan always seem to have her phone nearby? Why was she sometimes oddly positioned, leaning just so, with her bag conveniently placed on the table? Why did she occasionally reference lines or arguments word for word weeks later, when most people could barely recall the gist? Princess Anne, known for her piercing observations, was among the first to notice. She wasn't one for paranoia or palace gossip, but she saw things, small details that others dismissed. Meghan's fingers hovering just a little too long near her phone screen. Her smile holding steady when discussions grew tense, almost as if she were collecting moments rather than experiencing them. And William? William, the future king, had inherited his mother's intuition. He could sense when something was wrong. For him, it wasn't about gadgets or devices. It was about Meghan repeating exact phrases he knew had only ever been spoken in private. Words that should never have found their way outside that room. Stop and ask yourself, if someone repeated your private words back to you, casually, as if it were nothing, wouldn't you feel a chill? Wouldn't you wonder how they remembered them so precisely? Wouldn't you suspect there was more at play? But here's the thing. Whispers in the palace aren't like whispers anywhere else. In your family, they fade. In the royal family, they grow. They take on a life of their own. Because every rumor carries potential consequences, not just for relationships, but for the institution itself. And so, the whispers about Meghan recording conversations became louder. Advisors glanced at each other during meetings. Family members hesitated before speaking. The trust that had been fragile from the start began to fracture. Was Meghan truly recording? No one could prove it. Not yet. But in the palace, perception often matters more than proof. If people believed she might be doing it, then the damage was already done. The bond of confidence was broken. The irony? Meghan herself had often spoken about feeling unsafe, feeling unprotected, feeling like she needed her own defense against the palace machine. Could recordings have been her armor? Her evidence? Her shield in case the monarchy turned against her? Or were they her weapon, carefully stored for the right moment to strike? The whispers turned into questions behind closed doors. Private discussions among William and a few trusted voices. Should they confront Meghan? Should they tighten security? Should they tell Charles? The risk was enormous. Because if they were wrong, accusing her would mean detonating the fragile peace that held the family together. And if they were right, the fallout would be catastrophic. Here's where things take a darker turn. One evening, according to insiders, Meghan allegedly slipped up. During a private moment, she repeated back a comment made by weeks earlier. A comment spoken in a meeting that Meghan wasn't even supposed to attend. How could she have known? How could she have remembered so precisely? That slip planted a seed of certainty in Anne's mind. Now the whispers were no longer just whispers. They were suspicions. And suspicions inside the palace are as good as fire. They spread. They ignite. They consume everything in their path. The atmosphere in the palace began to change. Conversations were shorter. Words were chosen with more caution. And Meghan? Meghan smiled through it all, seemingly unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the storm brewing around her. And that storm, once started, was unstoppable. Because what came next was not just a whisper. It was a voice. A sharp, unflinching voice from within the family. And that voice belonged to Princess Anne. She had always been known for it. The sharpness, the bluntness, the piercing clarity of a woman who didn't waste words and didn't tolerate nonsense. Princess Anne wasn't one for theatrics or speculation, but when her instincts flared, the family listened. And this time, her instincts were screaming. Imagine Anne in one of those private gatherings, a room full of polished oak furniture, papers neatly arranged, the air stiff with duty. She sits, back straight, eyes scanning, listening more than she speaks. And has the kind of presence that unsettles people. She doesn't fill the air with chatter. She fills it with silence that demands truth. And it was in that silence that she noticed Meghan. The little things stood out first. Meghan's phone, for instance, always there. On the table. In her hand. Never tucked away, never forgotten. Everyone else left their devices outside or at least kept them silent, unseen, almost as a gesture of respect to the sanctity of the meeting. But Meghan? Her phone was her constant companion. And notice the way Meghan's thumb brushed the screen, the way the black glass glowed faintly even when she wasn't looking directly at it. Was it just habit? Or was something more sinister at play? Anne's eyes missed nothing. She had grown up in a world where trust was currency and betrayal was always a possibility. She'd seen scandals come and go, affairs hidden and revealed, betrayals dressed up as loyalty. And as she watched Meghan, Anne's gut twisted with the uncomfortable sense that this wasn't simply a young duchess distracted by technology. What made it worse was Meghan's confidence. She would occasionally smile knowingly, sometimes even smirk, as if she carried a private joke, and began to ask herself, Was Meghan really listening to the words spoken in the room, or was she more focused on capturing them, keeping them, storing them away for later? And then came the moment that tipped the balance. A heated discussion unfolded about Harry's role, where he should stand, what duties he should or shouldn't perform, how the press would frame his every move. The conversation was private, raw, emotional, and delivered a blunt remark, one of those unfiltered lines only she could get away with. It was the kind of comment that, if repeated outside, would cause a media storm. She said it with the assurance that the walls of the room would hold it in. But weeks later, and heard her very words, almost verbatim, repeated back in Meghan's presence. The context was casual, the delivery smooth, but the echo of her remark was unmistakable. Meghan shouldn't have known it. She couldn't have known it. Unless, of course, she had a record of it. Imagine being in Anne's shoes. The realization settling like ice in her chest. The sensation of being watched, even when surrounded by family. The suspicion that someone wasn't just listening, but archiving her every word. For Anne, it wasn't paranoia, it was a pattern. And once she saw the pattern, she couldn't unsee it. Now, let's pause and ask, what would you do in her place? Would you confront Meghan directly, risk igniting a war inside the family? Would you whisper to others, planting seeds of doubt? Or would you wait, watching, gathering your own evidence? And chose to watch, but she also began to talk, quietly, discreetly, to William. William was already uneasy, but in sharp eye gave his suspicions weight. She told him about the phone, the smirks, the eerie repetition of private words. She didn't accuse outright. She didn't need to. Her reputation for honesty carried its own authority. If and saw smoke, William believed there was fire. And so, the unease grew heavier. Conversations in the palace became clipped, guarded. There was a subtle shift in body language, shoulders tensed, eyes darting toward Meghan's ever-present phone. Even Charles, who had a habit of rambling in private, grew more cautious. The atmosphere thickened with suspicion, and Meghan, whether she noticed or not, was at the center of it all. But here's the twist. Meghan had always spoken about her fear of being silenced, her feeling that the palace was working against her. What if, in her mind, recordings were her safeguard? What if she believed she needed proof of what was said, ammunition to protect herself if things went sour? Could Anne, with all her bluntness, have misunderstood a survival tactic as a betrayal? It's a fair question. Yet, fair or not, Anne's conviction hardened. She knew what she had seen, and she wasn't one to mince words. For her, family loyalty came first. And the idea that Meghan was quietly undermining that loyalty, capturing their most vulnerable moments to use later, was unacceptable. And William? William's blood ran cold. If Anne was right, then everything he feared was true. Every private word could one day be a headline. Every emotional outburst could become ammunition. For a man destined to be king, that was more than betrayal. It was a threat to the crown itself. But here's where the story takes its next turn. Because Anne Sharp I didn't just raise suspicions. It sparked William's own discovery, a moment that turned whispers and glances into something far more undeniable. And what William realized would not only confirm Anne's fears, it would make them infinitely worse. For William, it began with unease. He had inherited his mother's instinct for reading people, the subtle flickers of expression, the tones of voice that others missed, the tension in a room when something was off. Diana had been able to see through facades, to sense manipulation, to detect when someone wasn't being genuine. And William, though more reserved, carried that same intuition. It had served him well in his public life. But in the private life of the palace, it was now screaming at him that something wasn't right. He had brushed off the first few oddities. Meghan repeating phrases from private discussions. Meghan referencing arguments no one outside a closed-door meeting should have known. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Perhaps her memory was sharper than most, or maybe Harry had shared details with her. But the more it happened, the harder it became to dismiss. One moment, in particular, crystallized his suspicion. There had been a meeting with his father, Charles, and a few senior advisors. Meghan wasn't present. It was a tense discussion about the press and Harry's role in upcoming engagements. Charles had used a very specific phrase, one of those idiosyncratic turns of speech that only he would say. A week later, at a family gathering, William heard Meghan echo the very same phrase, almost word for word, in casual conversation. Not only did she repeat it, she wove it seamlessly into her point, as if she had been. William froze. His mind raced. How could she possibly know that? The only way was if someone told her, or if she had access in another way. And Harry? Harry had been in that meeting, yes, but would he really share every single phrase in such precise detail? William doubted it. This was the moment William's unease turned into certainty. He didn't want to believe it, but Anne's warnings suddenly rang louder in his mind. He began to notice Meghan more closely. How often she carried her phone, even in private family spaces. How she rarely left it out of sight. How sometimes she set it face down, a position that to anyone else might seem casual, but to William looked deliberate. Was the microphone still active? Was something capturing everything, right there on the table, in front of them all? Think about it. You're sitting with your family, sharing fears, frustrations, raw emotions, and you realize someone might be recording you. The paranoia alone would eat at you. For William, who had spent his entire life wary of being overheard, wary of leaks, wary of betrayal, the suspicion was almost unbearable. He began to test her, not openly, but subtly. He would make small remarks in private settings, things slightly out of place, details that weren't essential but unusual. Then he'd wait, watching to see if Meghan later referenced them. And sometimes she did. Not always, not obviously, but enough that the pattern grew harder to ignore. The pain of it was personal. Meghan wasn't just another figure in the palace. She was his brother's wife. The woman Harry had chosen. The woman Harry had defended against the world. Confronting her would mean confronting Harry, too. And that was the last thing William wanted. Their relationship was already strained. The thought of accusing Meghan of secretly recording them threatened to shatter it completely. But the more William saw, the more impossible it became to stay silent. Now, let's pause and put ourselves in William's shoes. Imagine being the heir to the throne, already carrying the weight of the monarchy's survival on your shoulders, already haunted by the ghosts of leaks and scandals from the past. Your mother's private phone calls had once been plastered across tabloids. Your father's intimate words had once been ridiculed in the press. You had lived through betrayal, invasion, humiliation. And now, standing in your own home, you feel history repeating itself. Not from outsiders this time, but from within your own family circle. The irony was cutting. Meghan had built her public narrative on privacy, on the pain of being hounded, on the trauma of intrusion. And yet, if William's instincts were right, she was the one intruding. She was the one crossing the line, taking the words spoken in confidence and storing them for later use. Was it protection? Was it leverage? Or was it simply strategy? William didn't know. But he knew enough to feel the betrayal like a knife. It gnawed at him day and night. He found himself replaying conversations in his mind, asking whether he had revealed too much, whether his words might one day appear in a book, a documentary, or a tell-all interview. The trust he had once given freely was now poisoned. And then came the breaking point. Meghan made a comment during a private dinner, just a passing remark, but it included details of a conversation William had had earlier that week with Charles and Anne. A conversation that had taken place with the strictest privacy. The only way she could have known was if she had access to it directly. William locked eyes with and across the table. He didn't need to say anything. The look was enough. They both knew. The suspicion had become reality in William's mind. Meghan was recording them. Maybe not every second, maybe not every setting, but enough to leave them exposed. Enough to make their most private words feel like ammunition waiting to be used. And for William, that realization was devastating. Because it wasn't just about Meghan anymore. It was about Harry. If Meghan was doing this, then Harry was either complicit or completely oblivious. Either way, William's trust in his brother was fractured beyond repair. The seeds of division had been planted, watered by suspicion, and grown into a wall between brothers that no apology could easily tear down. But William's discovery didn't remain a private torment for long. Because once he connected the dots, he knew he had to act. And that meant confronting a truth the entire family had been avoiding. The storm was no longer in whispers. It was about to explode. Because the next chapter wasn't about suspicion anymore. It was about what exactly Meghan may have recorded, and why those conversations were more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. These weren't ordinary chats. These weren't polite family teas or idle conversations about the weather. The palace meetings in question were the beating heart of the monarchy's strategy, confidential gatherings where the future of the crown was shaped. And it was in these moments, the most private of all, that suspicions arose Meghan might have been pressing record. Imagine the scene. A polished table stretching the length of a private chamber, portraits of monarchs past glaring down, servants dismissed, and doors closed tight. Only the most trusted family members and senior advisors were allowed inside. These were war room discussions, held away from cameras and microphones, where tempers flared, voices cracked, and vulnerabilities were laid bare. The public would only ever see the polished facade, but behind closed doors, that was where the real monarchy lived. Topics discussed in these meetings weren't trivial. They were explosive. Conversations about Prince Andrew's scandals, about Charles's public image, about William's growing responsibilities, about Harry's role, his future, and, yes, his marriage to Meghan. In those rooms, feelings were raw, blunt words were spoken, and strategies were crafted to protect the monarchy at all costs. Now pause for a moment and imagine if those conversations weren't safe. Imagine if someone in the room, or connected to the room, had a record of them. What could that mean? Every vulnerability, every slip of the tongue, every unguarded thought could become a headline. Every emotional outburst could be repackaged as scandal. For the royal family, secrecy is survival. The walls of those palaces don't just protect stone and tradition, they protect words. Words that, if leaked, could ignite political storms, public outrage, and media frenzies. And that's why the idea that Meghan may have recorded these meetings struck at the monarchy's core. It wasn't just betrayal. It was existential. According to whispers, the specific meetings under suspicion included some of the most sensitive of Harry's time in the UK. Heated discussions about whether he and Meghan should be allowed to continue using their HRH titles after stepping back. Arguments about their security arrangements. Conversations about how much information to release to the press versus what to keep hidden. Picture Meghan sitting there, poised, polite, occasionally interjecting, but with her phone close at hand, angled just so. It would have looked natural, harmless. But to and William, the phone became a symbol of something darker. Was it really just a phone? Or was it a vault of secrets, quietly collecting their words for future use? One meeting in particular became a turning point. It was a tense session about Harry and Meghan's growing distance from royal duties. Voices were raised, and, blunt as ever, expressed her doubts about Meghan's ability to adapt to royal life. William argued passionately about preserving the institution's image. Charles fretted about balancing compassion for Harry with duty to the monarchy. Emotions were raw, the kind of honesty that could never be scripted for public view. And yet, weeks later, some of the themes from that very meeting appeared in Meghan and Harry's interviews. Phrases, concerns, and sentiments that hadn't been spoken in public before. Coincidence? Or evidence? William and Anne weren't so sure. The overlap was too precise, too familiar. Let me ask you, if you were in that room, bearing your frustrations and fears, and then you saw them echoed later in the media, wouldn't you feel betrayed? Wouldn't you wonder if your words had been stolen? The potential damage was staggering. Imagine if those recordings, if they existed, contained Charles expressing doubt about Harry's decisions. Imagine if Anne's blunt criticisms were made public. Imagine if William's private frustrations about the pressures of kingship were leaked. Each recording could be a weapon, each word a headline. And here's where the paranoia deepened. If Meghan had recordings, where were they stored? On her phone? Backed up to the cloud? Shared with trusted allies? Did Harry know? Was he complicit? Or was he being kept in the dark, just like the rest of the family? The irony was sharp. The palace had always been obsessed with leaks from staff, from courtiers, from journalists hungry for scandal. They never imagined the leak might come from within the family itself. From a duchess sitting at their table, nodding politely, while preserving every syllable for a future payday. But this wasn't just about paranoia. There were moments that gave the suspicions weight. Meghan would recall specific details weeks later, details no one expected her to remember. She referenced moods, tones, and exact phrasings that had only been spoken in those closed-door sessions. And then William exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't chance. This wasn't casual memory. This was deliberate. And that's why these palace meetings became the fulcrum of suspicion. They weren't trivial, they were vital. And if Meghan had truly captured them, the monarchy itself was at risk. Because what's more dangerous than a scandal? Evidence. Hard, undeniable, unfiltered evidence. And that's exactly what Anne and William feared Meghan might be sitting on. But it wasn't just fear. Soon, according to palace whispers, something tangible surfaced. Something that made suspicion feel dangerously close to confirmation. And once that evidence appeared, the whispers turned into alarms that no one could ignore. It always begins as rumor. But rumor becomes poison when a fragment of evidence drips into the mix. And for the royal family, that evidence came quietly, almost too quietly, yet it struck like thunder. Anne's suspicions had stirred the fire. William's observations had fanned the flames. But what they encountered next felt like smoke rising from somewhere far more dangerous. Something that made whispers no longer dismissible. Something that suggested Meghan might not just have been careless with memory, but actively holding on to proof of what had been said inside those locked palace rooms. The moment didn't come from a dramatic discovery of a bug or a wire. It wasn't a dramatic scene straight out of a spy thriller. It was subtler, almost insidious. One evening, during a family dinner, Meghan let slip a detail from a meeting she hadn't been present at. A specific remark Charles had made, down to the cadence of his words. It wasn't something Harry could have repeated casually. It was too precise, too exact. William froze, the memory of his father's phrasing echoing in his mind. He locked eyes with Anne, who didn't need to say a word. She had seen it too. But that was only the beginning. Whispers emerged among staff that Meghan's phone was unusual. A junior aide once commented that it seemed to be always on, even when Meghan wasn't actively using it. Some suggested she had a habit of keeping the recording function open in the background, perhaps innocently, perhaps deliberately. One insider recalled overhearing a faint clicking sound when Meghan adjusted her device during a private session. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in an environment where trust is brittle, nothing is dismissed as mere chance. Then came the real crack in the dam. According to accounts later whispered within palace circles, an assistant discovered what appeared to be backups, audio files that had been uploaded to a private cloud account linked to Meghan. The assistant, horrified, didn't dare confront Meghan directly but reported the concern to higher-ups. The files, allegedly, contained fragments of recognizable conversations, voices that were unmistakably royal. They weren't full meetings, but they were enough to make the blood run cold. Think about that. Imagine being a staff member stumbling across even a few seconds of audio that should never have existed. A snippet of William's frustration. A sharp remark from Anne. A sigh from Charles that revealed exhaustion he would never show in public. Those fragments were enough to confirm what no one wanted to believe. The possibility that Meghan had been recording them. The implications were terrifying. If fragments had surfaced, what else was hidden? How many hours of recordings existed? Were they stored on multiple devices? Shared with Harry? Sent to confidants outside the palace? No one knew. And not knowing was perhaps the most dangerous part. William, already unsettled, now found himself gripped with a new kind of dread. He thought of his children. Could private remarks about George, Charlotte, or Louis one day be twisted into headlines? Could conversations about his future as king be repackaged for public consumption? Every possibility gnawed at him like a vulture picking apart trust. And, too, felt vindicated and enraged. Her sharp observations had been dismissed as paranoia by some, but now she had proof, however fragile, that her instincts had been right all along. And was not the type to sit back quietly. She pushed harder, demanding answers, demanding action. Charles, however, was caught in the middle. For him, the thought of his son's wife secretly taping their private conversations was devastating, but so was the idea of accusing her without undeniable proof. His reign had only just begun to steady after decades of scandal. Another eruption could be catastrophic. The monarchy couldn't afford another family implosion on the scale of Diana and Charles, or Harry and Meghan. Yet doing nothing meant living with the ticking time bomb of recordings that could surface at any moment. Let's pause here and ask, what would you do? If you were Charles, would you confront Meghan directly, risking an explosion that could drive Harry even further away? Or would you quietly investigate, searching for more evidence before making a move? The family chose caution. Quiet investigation. Watching Meghan more closely. Restricting access to meetings. Reducing the flow of sensitive information when she was present. Every measure came at the cost of trust, and Meghan, if she noticed, must have felt the walls closing in. But here's where the contradictions cut deepest. Meghan, the Duchess who spoke publicly about being silenced, about having no voice, might have been keeping the ultimate voice of all, the literal voices of her in-laws, captured forever. Privacy champion turned secret archivist. Hypocrisy or strategy? Protection or betrayal? The fragments of evidence haunted William and Anne. They knew what it meant. If Meghan truly had recordings, they weren't just personal keepsakes. They were leverage, a weapon, a currency that could be traded for media deals, legal protection, or public sympathy. And if unleashed, those recordings could devastate the monarchy in ways no tabloid rumor ever could. But what was Meghan's motive? What was the endgame? That was the question clawing at them all. And the more they thought about it, the more they realized her motive might be even more shocking than the recordings themselves. Because this wasn't just about protection. It wasn't just about survival. It was about power. And that revelation would shake the palace to its core. The question of motive was not just idle speculation. It became the central obsession of those within the palace walls. Why would Meghan, already holding the highest profile position a duchess could imagine, risk alienating herself from the very family she married into? The answer, according to palace insiders, was chilling in its audacity. From the beginning, Meghan had been meticulous about narrative control. Her public image was carefully curated, her every move analyzed, and her every word measured. But behind the camera-ready smile and poised gestures, she was said to have harbored ambitions that went far beyond the ceremonial duties of a royal spouse. Influence, power, and legacy, all of it could be amplified if she held the secrets of those around her. Think of it this way: knowledge is power, and recordings are knowledge frozen in time. Every conversation, every hesitation, every unguarded opinion captured in those files was a treasure trove of leverage. One snippet could bolster a book deal. Another could shape a media narrative. And yet another could be deployed to sway public opinion in her favor, perhaps subtly, perhaps shockingly. Palace insiders told of late-night conversations among William, Charles, and Anne, where the very idea of Meghan's potential collection of recordings was dissected. They considered the implications. Financial. How much could Harry and Meghan demand for stories only they held the keys to? Political. How could leaked conversations destabilize public confidence in the monarchy? Emotional. How could such evidence corrode the bonds between family members, trust shattered irreparably? It was a strategic approach unlike any the royal family had faced. Unlike previous scandals, which were reactive, briefings, denials, and damage control, this was proactive in a way that frightened them. Whoever held the recordings wasn't just responding to events. They were creating them. Every secret collected, every word preserved, could be activated at the most opportune moment to rewrite history on their terms. And the more they dug, the more subtle patterns emerged. Meghan's meticulous memory of conversations, her insistence on recording details that seemed inconsequential at the time, even her frequent references to lessons learned from certain discussions, all suggested forethought. She was building a library of insight, a dossier that could be used whenever necessary. The whispers grew louder. She wasn't just a participant in royal life. She was an archivist of influence. But motive isn't just strategy. There was a deeply emotional layer to this theory. Meghan had consistently felt that the institution, and, by extension, her husband, was constrained by outdated expectations. The palace, in her eyes, demanded conformity over authenticity, tradition over personal truth. By keeping her own record, she could claim agency over events, controlling the narrative even when she felt powerless within the system. Consider the irony. The very family whose image she was said to preserve could also be the subject of her power. To some, it was revenge. To others, self-preservation. But most chillingly, it was leverage. Every conversation, every candid remark captured, was a form of insurance against the unpredictability of royal life. And yet, the theory had another layer that no one wanted to articulate openly. What if these recordings weren't meant just for media deals or books? What if they were intended to protect Harry, or even to protect Meghan herself, from perceived betrayals? Could she have feared that without documentation, her position within the royal hierarchy would be vulnerable? Could she have seen herself as safeguarding a version of truth that only she could present, regardless of family disputes or palace politics? So, what was Meghan's true motive? Was it ambition, self-preservation, strategy, or something even more personal? The answers were tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly out of reach. And that tension, the question of why and for what purpose, would ultimately drive the next chapter of this unfolding royal saga. The discovery, or even the mere suspicion, of Meghan's secret recordings sent shockwaves through the palace corridors, though they were never announced publicly. For those inside, the air was thick with tension. Staff whispered nervously in corners, aides glanced over their shoulders, and meetings once conducted with ease were now marked by subtle suspicion. Every glance, every remark, every casual gesture could be a seed of evidence, or a trigger for scandal. William, ever the guardian of tradition, felt the weight of responsibility pressing down like never before. He had to protect the integrity of the monarchy, shield his family from public embarrassment, and navigate a minefield of personal betrayal, all at the same time. Every decision became fraught with consequence. A wrong move could result in leaked conversations, sensational headlines, and irreparable damage to the royal family's public image. And, sharp and analytical, began systematically reviewing internal protocols. She questioned who had access to sensitive information and whether Meghan's movements had been observed or documented. Her experience in managing royal logistics and crisis situations gave her a unique perspective. She understood that leaks, intentional or accidental, could cripple even the most carefully guarded institution. She also knew that confronting the issue directly risked pushing Meghan further into secrecy or defensive posturing. The reactions within the palace weren't just strategic, they were emotional. Charles, ever the mediator, felt torn. On one hand, he wanted to believe in Meghan's loyalty and honor. On the other, evidence, however circumstantial, suggested a breach of trust that was deeply personal. Every private conversation he had with William and became a delicate negotiation, balancing suspicion with hope that no malicious intent existed. Staff, too, were caught in the crossfire. Some were terrified, feeling that every word spoken within palace walls could be captured and later weaponized. Others were frustrated, sensing that loyalty alone might no longer be enough to guarantee security or discretion. Rumors began circulating, aides talking in hushed tones about strange devices, conversations disappearing from memory cards, or whispered warnings about certain topics being off-limits in Meghan's presence. The palace's social dynamics shifted. Long-standing routines were upended. Meetings became smaller, more controlled. Conversations that were once candid were now measured. Every interaction was scrutinized for potential exposure. It was as though the palace had become a live wire, charged with anxiety, waiting for the slightest spark to ignite a scandal. Meanwhile, Meghan's demeanor remained outwardly composed. To the public, she continued to charm and engage with poise, maintaining the image of a dutiful duchess concerned with social causes and public appearances. But insiders began to notice subtle cues, glances that lingered a moment too long, pockets of secrecy in scheduling, moments of unexplained nervous energy. These nuances fueled speculation. Was she aware of the scrutiny? Was she deliberately testing the boundaries? One particularly tense moment reportedly occurred during a private family gathering. Conversations were carefully moderated, yet Meghan managed to reference an exchange that should have been confined to a previous, closed-door meeting. William and exchanged quick, knowing looks, their suspicions momentarily confirmed without a word needing to be spoken. It was a small incident, but it left a lasting impression. If she had access to information she shouldn't, how much more might she know? The tension didn't just affect interactions, it also reshaped decision-making processes. Important discussions, once conducted openly, were now filtered through layers of precaution. Staff had to consider which topics were safe to discuss and which could become potential ammunition if recorded. This created a culture of caution, perhaps even fear, that contrasted sharply with the openness that had characterized palace life before Meghan's arrival. The palace's internal investigations, conducted discreetly, uncovered a pattern of anomalies. Certain digital devices were often in Meghan's possession or in areas where private conversations occurred. Data logs hinted at activity that didn't align with normal usage. Though no definitive proof of malicious intent was found, the pattern was enough to make William, Anne, and Charles wary. This environment of suspicion had a profound psychological impact. Trust, the invisible glue that held the family together, began to erode. Simple interactions became exercises in caution and diplomacy. Every word, every gesture, every private meeting carried the implicit question, could this be recorded? And if it were, how might it be used? The public, of course, remained unaware of the tension simmering behind palace walls. To them, Meghan's image remained intact, poised, charitable, and engaged. But within the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, the story was far more complex. Allies were forced to second-guess their loyalty, secrets were guarded more tightly than ever, and the very fabric of family trust was being tested. And yet, in the midst of this, Meghan seemed to operate with a calm, almost imperceptible strategy. Whether this was deliberate or coincidental, insiders couldn't say. But the effect was undeniable. She had shifted the power dynamic subtly, holding in her possession the potential to influence not just family relationships, but the narrative of the monarchy itself. The palace, once a place of measured certainty and tradition, now operated under a cloud of uncertainty. Every family member, every aide, every official had to weigh their words carefully. The threat wasn't overt. There was no dramatic confrontation, yet. The threat was insidious, quietly present in every conversation, in every glance, in every decision. And this silent tension would set the stage for the next revelation, one that would make the palace realize that Meghan's recordings, if they existed as suspected, could change everything. Not tomorrow, not next week, but in a way that would ripple through the monarchy and the media alike, with consequences no one could fully predict. The idea that Meghan might have been recording conversations inside the palace sent immediate alarm bells through the highest levels of the royal household. But beyond the personal shock, a chilling question arose. What if these recordings made their way into the media? The very thought of confidential family discussions or strategic planning sessions becoming public was enough to galvanize urgent action. William and Anne, realizing the gravity of the situation, convened a private strategy meeting with senior aides. The goal was twofold: assess the potential risk of leaks and develop a plan to contain any information that might surface. If even a hint of this reaches the press, William reportedly said, the consequences could be catastrophic. We have to be prepared for every scenario. The first step was to map out potential vulnerabilities. Staff members were questioned discreetly about any unusual activity they might have noticed. Misplaced devices, conversations held in private that seemed to attract Meghan's attention, or any behavior that seemed out of the ordinary. Every detail, no matter how minor, was considered a potential clue, and, ever meticulous, suggested reviewing media monitoring reports. They combed through newspapers, television broadcasts, and early online platforms, looking for patterns. Were there stories that seemed unusually precise? Did certain journalists consistently publish insights that were too specific to have been gleaned from standard sources? Every anomaly raised eyebrows. Meanwhile, internal communications were tightened. Sensitive meetings were moved to smaller, more secure rooms. Devices were restricted, and staff were reminded of confidentiality protocols in a series of discreet briefings. Even casual conversations in hallways were discouraged if they pertained to family matters. It was a significant shift from the previously open and trusting environment, but necessity dictated caution. The palace also considered the psychological dimension. Staff were under immense pressure, and the mere suspicion of recordings created an atmosphere of paranoia. Leadership emphasized vigilance without creating outright fear, a delicate balance. They needed everyone to remain calm, observant, and discreet, ensuring that no inadvertent slip could be exploited. In parallel, a hypothetical media strategy was drafted. Advisors discussed how to respond if sensitive information surfaced publicly. The plan included preemptive narratives emphasizing loyalty, protecting the royal family's integrity, and framing any leaks as breaches of trust rather than reflections on individual actions. The aim was to control the story before the story controlled them. The palace also began assessing Meghan's potential motives. Insider accounts suggested that if recordings did exist, they could be leveraged for future media deals, memoirs, or other commercial endeavors. This possibility added urgency. Any delay could result in irreversible damage if materials were released strategically at a later date. Interestingly, the strategy discussions revealed subtle tensions among senior staff. Some were wary of confronting Meghan directly, fearing it could backfire. Others insisted on immediate, decisive action to prevent further risk. The differing approaches reflected a broader dilemma. How do you manage a high-profile individual who wields potential information power without triggering a scandal prematurely? Meanwhile, William and Anne started identifying the key, high-value conversations. These included discussions about royal engagements, internal family disputes, financial planning, and strategic decisions regarding public appearances. Any recording of these moments could not only embarrass the family, but also alter public perception in ways that were difficult to control. The palace also examined potential vulnerabilities in Meghan's network. Who were her closest aides? Who had access to her private quarters? Was there anyone who might inadvertently or deliberately facilitate the dissemination of sensitive material? These questions drove an internal review that was both exhaustive and tense. Every staff member's loyalty and behavior were evaluated, and subtle adjustments were made to reporting lines and access permissions. Yet, amid all this scrutiny, Meghan maintained a composed public persona. Her engagements continued smoothly, charity work was highlighted, and she appeared the picture of a committed royal. This contrast between her public image and the private suspicions created a complex dynamic for those inside the palace. They had to navigate the delicate balance of outward appearances and internal security, all while avoiding actions that could provoke public scrutiny. Despite the precautions, the fear of leaks was palpable. Every press briefing, every journalist inquiry, every rumor was scrutinized for hidden meanings. The palace even engaged external experts to monitor for potential signs of recorded content being funneled to media outlets. It was a high-stakes game of anticipation and prevention, where one misstep could spiral into a global scandal. At the same time, the family considered preemptive countermeasures. Statements were drafted emphasizing trust and discretion. Scenarios were rehearsed for potential confrontations with Meghan, and contingency plans were established for rapid responses. But the underlying question remained: how much did Meghan truly have, and how prepared was she to use it? This tension reached a boiling point in several private discussions, where the possibility of immediate disclosure was debated. Some advisors argued that confronting Meghan directly could neutralize the threat, while others feared that it might provoke a media spectacle or a legal battle. The palace was caught between caution and action, each option carrying risks that could not be underestimated. And as these strategies unfolded, a subtle realization emerged: the existence of recordings, or even the suspicion of them, was changing the very fabric of palace operations. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision was now filtered through the lens of potential exposure. Trust was no longer automatic. Discretion had become the currency of survival. But what Meghan had planned, or whether she even had concrete recordings, remained an open question. And the palace knew that the moment of revelation, whenever it came, could strike like lightning, illuminating secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. The tension inside the palace had reached a breaking point. By now, it was no longer just about suspicion. It had become a tangible strain on family dynamics. William and Anne could feel the subtle shifts: the way Meghan moved through the corridors with a measured composure, the way staff hesitated before speaking, and the small, almost imperceptible looks exchanged between family members during meetings. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions and restrained caution. It started with what seemed like minor confrontations, brief, pointed discussions in hallways, questions that were subtly loaded, and quick exchanges where meaning lingered longer than the words themselves. At first, these incidents were brushed off as normal family disagreements, but the pattern became undeniable. There was a growing divide between Meghan and certain members of the royal household, and every interaction carried the weight of suspicion. And, in particular, found herself navigating the delicate balance between confrontation and diplomacy. She valued transparency and had always believed in addressing issues directly. But she also understood that a misstep could escalate tensions into a full-blown public scandal. During one meeting, and reportedly challenged Meghan on a minor inconsistency, phrasing it carefully. "I just want to make sure we're all on the same page regarding the schedules. It's crucial for the family and the public to trust our coordination." Meghan's response was calm, almost rehearsed, yet there was an edge that hinted at defensive maneuvering. The encounter left, and with an uneasy sense that much more was happening beneath the surface than anyone could articulate. William, meanwhile, wrestled with his own emotional response. As the elder son and future king, he felt the dual burden of protecting the monarchy and managing family harmony. He could sense the undercurrents of deception, but he also remembered the early days of Meghan's integration into the family, the charm, the intelligence, the public composure. Reconciling these two images was emotionally exhausting. He asked himself repeatedly, how much of Meghan's behavior was strategic, and how much was genuine? The confrontations escalated when private meetings were convened to discuss sensitive topics, financial planning, royal engagements, and security protocols. Meghan's presence in these sessions created a palpable tension, as though the very act of listening carried a potential threat. Every suggestion, every decision, was now made with the implicit question, could this be recorded? Staff members also became unwitting participants in these tensions. They were caught between loyalty to the family and fear of being implicated in potential leaks. Some were instructed to limit interactions with Meghan, while others found themselves subtly reassigned to avoid sensitive areas. The reorganization, though discreet, sent a clear message. The palace could no longer operate under the same assumptions of trust. A particularly tense confrontation occurred during a family briefing on a high-profile event. Meghan questioned a logistical decision in a manner that was polite on the surface but carried a subtle challenge. William responded with measured firmness, emphasizing the importance of protocol and tradition, and observed silently, noting the underlying power dynamics at play. The conversation ended without a clear resolution, but it left an indelible mark on the room, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile balance that now defined palace interactions. Rumors of private recordings, whether true or perceived, fueled these confrontations. Staff reported moments when Meghan appeared unusually aware of details she shouldn't have known. For example, she would reference conversations or decisions from earlier meetings that had been intended to remain confidential. William and exchanged knowing glances during these moments, their suspicions intensifying with each subtle revelation. The emotional toll on the family was significant. William and struggled to maintain composure in public while navigating a minefield of private concerns. Conversations that once flowed freely were now measured, cautious, and laden with implications. Trust, the cornerstone of any family dynamic, was under siege. Every interaction carried the weight of potential consequences, and the stakes extended far beyond personal grievances. They touched the reputation and stability of the monarchy itself. Amid these tensions, Meghan's behavior remained outwardly composed. She continued her public appearances, charitable engagements, and media interactions with poise, giving the impression of a confident and capable duchess. This contrast between public persona and private suspicion only heightened the internal strain. Those inside the palace were left questioning not only her intentions, but also the broader implications for family cohesion and institutional integrity. Legal advisors and senior aides began preparing contingency plans, anticipating that confrontations might escalate into formal disputes or public controversies. They considered scenarios ranging from mediated discussions to more drastic measures, all aimed at protecting the family while addressing the potential threat posed by the recordings. These preparations underscored the seriousness of the situation. What had started as suspicion was now being treated as a tangible risk with far-reaching consequences. The palace environment was now defined by an intricate dance of caution, strategy, and emotional restraint. William and Charles found themselves constantly evaluating how to communicate, what to disclose, and when to intervene. Every decision carried the potential for ripple effects that could impact not only immediate relationships, but also public perception and historical legacy. And yet, The question that loomed largest remained unanswered. Did Meghan actually possess recordings of sensitive conversations? And if so, what were her intentions? The possibility that these materials could be released strategically, whether for personal gain, media leverage, or other purposes, hung over every interaction like a dark cloud. This climate of confrontation, suspicion, and strategic maneuvering set the stage for the next chapter. The potential fallout if these recordings ever surfaced in the public domain, a scenario that could redefine the monarchy and expose secrets long thought to be untouchable.